Hi, and welcome to week 5. This week, we are going to talk about East Asia first. And if you look at the map, you see that bounded on the southwest by the Himalayas and the Western Mountains, which are tectonically active because they're being pushed up by colliding plates. Also, the and I'm starting again. Hi, and welcome to week 5. This week, we are going to start with East Asia. And here's a map of the physiography of East Asia. The southwest is bounded by the Himalayas and other mountains, which are tectonically active because they're being pushed up. So earthquakes are common there. And just to the north, the Qinghai Zhang Plateau is also being pushed up. So this entire area is in the process of physically changing. If we look at the deserts, we see the Taklamakan Desert, we see the Gobi Desert, and the Ordos Desert. And those areas are basically no one lives there because it's a desert. Um, the the more interesting things for population and people are the river basins and their valleys and their deltas. So the Red Basin to the east has its four major rivers: the Yangtze, the Yellow, the Pearl, and the Changjiang. And all of these are heavily populated along the length of them, and then where they outlet into the seas off of the eastern coast of China, this where you have some large industrial areas and large population clusters. So as far as culturally here, about 10,000 years ago, culture began to start here. This is another hearth area where they have started with their own traditions, their own technologies, their own religions, and everything without being influenced by anything outside. And then from this hearth, those ideas can spread. Uh, Most people live on China's east coast where the fertile land is. And you also have the access to the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea, which all open to the Pacific. So this is another reason why you have a lot of people living there for farming and for manufacturing. Now, another portion of this area is tectonically active, and this is Japan. And what you can see here is that there are two plates that are meeting together, and they are pushing up these volcanic islands that make up Japan. There are is very earthquake prone, and if you remember in 2011, there was the earthquake that caused the Fukushima nuclear reactor to melt down because of the resultant tsunami. So this is the area that sees the most tectonic action here. Now, I want you to know that one of the ways that we can tell, see, here's North Korea. It's not anywhere near a tectonic boundary or anything. So there aren't faults that are there to rupture to cause earthquakes. But we can tell when North Korea sets off one of its weapons because it's almost always consistently a 3.8 to 4.0 earthquake located in North Korea. All right, climates. So we can see that to the western part of China, you have H, which is the highland, and then you have these huge swaths of deserts. The southeastern portion is very similar to the southeastern portion of the United States. And then the northeastern portion is also the humid cold climate. So both of these areas, you can grow crops. There's good vegetation. It's just that one is a little bit drier than the other. Now, let's look at the population map. The population is, you can pretty much overlay it with the climate map. Um, you can see all of the people living along the East Coast. Go back, you see the bulge right here. Yes, for all of the humid temperate and uh, humid cold, same population patterns. Now, the good thing about these areas is that there have been settled over time because of the soil fertility and because of water. The deltas and the great cities were historically built along there, and every other invading faction that came into China also stayed populated in these areas for the exact same reasons. Now, about 6,000 years ago, where the hearth was developing here, independent of the other cultures, crops and livestock and city institutions, the formation of states, all of these were developing in this area. In 1700 BC, they started the dynasties that we hear of in China. Over here. This is where you have one ruler, and then all the following rulers come from that person's bloodline. The Han dynasty was the first, and it was one of the longest, so much so that even today, the ethnic Chinese call themselves the people of Han. The dynastic rule lasted for more than 3,500 years, and Confucianism and Buddhism came out and spread through the realm during this time. In 1205, the Mongol invasion with Genghis Khan came in, and they didn't try to force the rules on the Chinese. Instead, they adopted many of the Chinese ways, and this is called Hanification. This dynasty, the Mongol invasion ended in 1368. And after this, there were two more dynasties, the Ming and the Qing. And the Ming dynasty moved out. It took over territories in Korea, in Mongolia, in Myanmar, and then it put fleets to go into the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean so that it could go adopt more land and force more trade. But what happened was from 1645 to 1715, the world experienced a little ice age. And if you remember all the way back to week one and reading that ridiculously long climate change document that I put together, there was a period where sunspots basically stopped. And with the less sunspots, you're not getting as much energy coming towards Earth. And what it will actually do is it will cause global cooling. And during this little ice age, which is also called the Maunder Minimum, the glaciers retook, came down mountain valleys. It spread on every continent. So because this onset, all of the people, all the Chinese who were exploring outside of it had to regress to their own country so that they could go back and build infrastructure and feed their own people who were dying off. Now, other countries came in to East Asia, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, Portuguese, and they penetrated inland. They imported cheap goods into China, which broke some of China's internal industries because they were less expensive coming in than they were for the Chinese to actually make them. One of the horrible things that happened during this time was that the British started importing opium from India, and it was destroying the Chinese people and culture because they were addicted. They fought two opium wars from 1839 to 42, another one in 1857. And what happened after the second opium war, when the Chinese lost, the English forced the Chinese to grow opium in their country. I think that was a very dark time. Now, again, here we are, the colonial powers carved out concessions, and they took areas in China where no Chinese were allowed. English wanted them just to be for English only. All of this lasted until the end of World War II in 1949, when China finally gained its independence. And with such a large area, a lot of different people, the Communist Party was formed by Mao Zedong to take this large group of people and bring them into one nation. Here you can see the influences from thousands of years of people flowing in and out, occupation and not. You have the Austro ones, the Indo-European ones, Mongolian. These all came in and out from that time. And then you can see the center of the country of China is basically Han, which is the official language of the country. All right. So when they decided to become communists, China took land from wealthy farmers and they used dams and levees so they could build up places where they could increase water flow to increase agricultural productivity so that people weren't starving. Literacy and education went up, health went up, child labor was reduced. And what they did at that point was anyone who was a leader or a scholar or had a high occupational job, and this happened in Venezuela too. They call this the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And what they did was they killed all of those people. And I think maybe as many as 30 million people died there as a result of this kind of reform to get rid of anything that resembled a middle or upper middle class. Because of the population growing so fast, China instituted their one-child policy. So instead of like India right now is still kind of on the curve up exponentially, China is actually starting to settle out because they decide to implement that. All right. China's marketplace. China decided, though, in the 80s, it's communist China, to go to a market economy. So China opened to the world industrial centers, oil and gas, agriculture, and technology. Right now, China has 85% of the entire world's rare earth elements, which puts them in a very powerful place as far as technology. The reason that China could industrialize so quickly is because, as you see along here, it has oil and gas and coal and nuclear plants. And those were put up quickly so that they could build the infrastructure and get industrialization happening at a fast rate over a very short period of time. Now, China is the world's biggest consumer and leading exporter of goods. So globalization is happening, and it's why China is considered one of the top 5 emerging economies in the world. China really wanted to work with the global market, but didn't want to have much of China westernized, influenced by Western values and cultures. So what they did was they set up these special economic zones, and they're all along the Pacific coast, and they're set up to attract foreign investment. There are tech hubs. The investors get tax breaks, land leases. They have easy import and export regulations. So companies are coming in and working on Chinese soil in these zones, but not in the mainland. It's brought so much money and investment into China, though. And with all of these being on the coast, they can maximize local trade opportunities, like with nearby countries. They've built roads, airports, seaports, so that these really are bringing a lot of money, a lot of ideas, and a lot of investment in technology into China from outside. Excuse me. All right. Now we are going to move on to Southeast Asia. This area is composed of countries and thousands of islands. There is the archipelago of Indonesia. There is mainland, which is Myanmar, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. You have the Malay Peninsula. You have the Philippines, which are a group of islands. And in between all of these, you have various seas, which there are passageways amongst all of them to be able to get from the Indian Ocean to the Philippine Sea to the Pacific. So not only is this area fragmented land wise, it also offers a lot of different ways to be able to get from island to island or even ocean to ocean. So whoever kind of owns the territory or thinks they own the territory of these seas is going to be seen as having a considerable advantage. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Now, on the mainland, there are four very important rivers. The first is in Myanmar, which is marked Burma on here, and it's the Irrawaddy. And it's kind of like when we looked at uh, Bangladesh, how the delta at the end of the river is the fertile land. It's where the people live. It's where you produce your food. It has that same importance to Burma. The other ones are the Red River, which is in Vietnam, and then the Mekong, which goes through Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, and then the Chao Phraya in Thailand. All of these river valleys are very important. Um, so, excuse me, many people along these rivers fish for food, so that's the source of their daily protein. And of course, countries upstream like China and the Mekong are thinking about putting more dams along it. So we've seen this phenomenon almost every single week. Whoever owns the upland can really affect, but the upriver can really affect those who live downriver. Now, this area is very tectonically active. If you look at this slide, you'll see all of the red lines. All of them are where plates, continental, where plates are meeting, and they're all moving in different directions. So every one of these areas that you see is tectonically active, and it affects all the other faults around it. And these are called microplates, and they're just uh, plates of lithosphere that are smaller than the regular tectonic plates. Five of the world's 20 largest earthquakes have happened here in Indonesia. And I don't remember if you remember the December 26th earthquake in Sumatra in Indonesia in 2004. And it was at 9.1 on the Richter scale. They said that the shaking lasted for 3 to 4 minutes long. And it was very, very, very close to the coast of Indonesia. Um, it said that it thrust the ocean floor up between 30 and 120 feet. Because it was so very close to the shore, it was only 20 minutes after the earthquake that the tsunami hit. And that's hardly enough time to do anything. But because of that, the world has set up a much larger tsunami watch station so that people will know immediately if they need to evacuate. There are also, if you look in the Philippines and also along Indonesia, volcanoes associated with these subducting plates. So you have your volcanoes and you have your earthquakes. Now, let's look at climate in this area. If you look at the Indonesia and the islands to the south, they're all humid equatorial climate, no dry season. And then if you move up onto the, excuse me, Thailand region, you're going to see that they're still humid equatorial, but they just have a drier winter. So basically, this entire area has an equatorial climate of one variety or another. Um, One thing that is interesting in this area is that with Borneo and Indonesia and other islands along the way, this is the third largest surviving rainforest area besides the Amazon and the Congo. Since people have lived on these islands for years, good portions of the forests were cut down for homes and for firewood, for energy sources. But enough of it is been protected now that it is actually thriving. And we're going to see that Indonesia has actually stopped deforestation by companies that want to come into their country to farm, and they don't want any more of it destroyed. So because we see all of these different islands and peninsulas, and because we know that most of these islands are inhabited, they have plants, they have animals, how is it that over such a large area, um, you could have such a migration? And periods in history before, when the earth was a lot cooler, um, and a lot of the water was taken up in glaciers and ice sheets, actually you had land bridges and exposed land that actually animals and plants could travel right across, and that people could. So here you see the East Indies, which is Indonesia right there, and then you're moving over towards Australia. You can see that there are actual land bridges that are available for this. And it didn't happen just one time in the last 50,000 years. It happened in pulses, for 3 or 4 pulses over that time, whenever we would go into a cooling cycle. And at those times, you could have the migration of people. It's thought that the first people of Australia got there about 50,000 years ago. So this may actually be like the initial event when you had people moving right into Australia. All right. So let's look at population. In the mainland, people live along the rivers and the deltas. The other place that you see that's highly populated is the island of Jawa in Indonesia. And even though it's not highly urbanized, there aren't a lot of big cities, it's becoming overpopulated. So much so that when a couple years ago, Indonesia decided that it wanted to buy the western half of the island of Papua. We're going to look at Papua New Guinea, the eastern half of that, next week. But one of the reasons that they bought that was because there was so much crowding that they were sending people over there with a promise to build them a house and money. And a lot of people took it to start a new beginning on the island. The other half of reason that they took it was because we're going to talk about palm oil in a minute, so I won't get there. But the good thing about these islands is because they're volcanic, because they have a nice moist climate, and because there's water available, they can actually harvest 3 full crops a year, which can be grown to feed the people of this country. So now we know different groups of people have kind of been populating and repopulating this area over the time. We know that trade with China and India and others brought in peoples and products and religions and other cultural things. So here's the colonial sphere of influence in Southeast Asia. Colonialism, because of the discontinuity of these lands and because of the barriers, this area was full of different kingdoms, sultanates, traditional governments, on so many different places. No group had tried to take over the others to try and consolidate a larger country. That different cultures, different languages, it was really a mosaic of cultures. So the Europeans decided that they would again take a map and divide and rule. Now, all of the countries here were colonized at one time or another, except for Thailand. And Thailand was strong enough to resist the French and the British. And then it ended up acting as a buffer between the two because they really hated each other. So it was the only place here that was never colonized. If you look at who came in to do this, France had what they called Indochina, and they were in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The British took over Myanmar and Malaysia, and the Netherlands took over Indonesia, which they called the East Indies. And the Dutch came and what they found were spices. And at that time, these were also called the Spice Islands because you had nutmeg and turmeric and black pepper and clove and things that you couldn't find anywhere in the world. And during that time, um, there uh, during that time, there was no refrigeration. So you ate for a day and that was it. But they found the spices could preserve food, but also make them taste better. So the Dutch got really rich from taking 17,000 of these islands, grouping them together as what we know is now Indonesia, by growing and harvesting the spices on their land. All right. So this is the ethnic mosaic of Southeast Asia. And you can see where you have the Thai and the Indonesian. You can see the crossover that you have on the mainland peninsula. Um, this is also very general because the finer detail you get, the more there are. But one of the really interesting things is you see these pockets of Chinese in purple, and the Chinese had great pulses of migration out of their country, and they would set up in areas, and then eventually that area would become known as like Little Chinatown because to the exclusion of others, that's what it is. And we're going to see the same thing. The Chinese fled in huge populations to Australia as well. All right. So the countries here decided to form, for economic purposes, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And when we look at Indonesia, it is one of the big emerging markets, one of the BRICS. They've had a lot of foreign investments in the garment industry, and machinery in Vietnam. There's been a lot of foreign investment in Laos for agriculture and raw materials. Cambodia is being known for its textiles, its footwear, its rubber. Myanmar is a failed state. There have been coup attempts, military overthrows. There hasn't been any long-term stable government for the people in my lifetime. So there's there's no group there that has had the ability to take charge and stay in control for any length of time in order to provide food for its people, build infrastructure, set up medical facilities. So right now, Myanmar is a failed state. Now, this Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they have two goals. One is that they want to promote the regional peace and stability through stable governments. It's kind of like in the European Union, where you have to have a stable government to even be considered becoming a member. And the second is to improve living standards and accelerate economic growth and social progress and cultural development. They believe that if they begin to act together again as a trading bloc, then they will have more sway on the international market. And in doing so, like the European Union, everybody won't be competing against each other within their own bloc. They would be developing things in each place that don't overlap too much, that then would be able to force the market to pay higher prices for them. So now let's talk about the 9 dashed line. Talk about the waterways here and how there are many of them so that you can transport ships and materials, in between many different seas and passes. Well, the bulk of the South China Sea is what lies in the middle of this area. And when China came independent, it dashed this line on a map and it said that it owned this sea territory, which will have maritime shipping implications, but it also is because if there's any oil or gas found underneath of the ocean bottom, then they want that to belong to them. Now, right now, China says it owns that, but it doesn't really own it. And in the international courts and stuff like that for maritime boundaries hasn't been settled. And I think it may be this way unless someone actually does drill for oil and gas, and then it might become a fight. But as of right now, people are claiming these different places, and nothing is really stuck yet. All right, now we're going to talk about palm oil. And palm oil is in so many products, you wouldn't believe it. It's in a lot of different foods. It's in your soap and your shampoo. It's in cosmetics. It's in biodiesel. It's in cleaning products. It's one of the most valuable resources in the world because it's used by so many companies in so many products. And you can see here that there are large palm oil plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia. And between these two countries, they produce about 85% of the world's palm oil. Now, what has happened in not just these areas, but in others, we talked about land grabs. And so companies like Seam Darbe, which is a Korean company with a very bad reputation of going in and taking land that they didn't pay for, have gone into Malaysia and Indonesia, and through corrupt governments, the land has been taken out from underneath the people who have traditionally lived there for hundreds of years and is given over to the palm oil companies. And a lot of these areas were tropical forest, and we know that tropical soil is thin and not very fertile. So in going in and doing so, they stripped all of the vegetation off of the lands. The people who actually owned the land weren't allowed to come back onto the lands. Um, they could work for them in some cases. Um, and then once the land was stripped and they planted the palm oil, you have more erosion because you have less roots holding the soil down. Not everything was a land grab. There are areas where companies came in and they said, we will build you houses, a school, and a medical clinic, and we will hire you and pay you a fair wage and lease the land. And it's worked out exactly the way that the company who came in presented it. So this, it's not every company is awful or horrible. But it had gotten to the point where so much of the land in Indonesia was being cut down from palm oil that a couple of years ago they passed a law that said no more new plantations for palm oil would be allowed on Indonesia. It was being just that destructive. So different companies have moved into other areas. And funny enough, most of them are rainforest areas. I just can't figure that out. Although, I mean, it's a good climate for the palm and everything, but anyway, so that's a huge market stabilizer for them for palm oil. And because it's used in so many products, it's always going to be you probably will not have a glut, like an over amount of palm oil glutting the market to make the prices crash. So that's one of the issues that we see in many countries that are in the tropical region, are palm oil plantations. Now let's look at how importing, exporting has changed in this area, in the ASEAN region with China over a period of 10 years. You can see on the exports between, excuse me, in 2000, a lot of these were going to other places. And now a lot of them are going to China. If you look at the imports, you'll see that as of 2010, a lot of importing was coming from China and not just from other places. So China has, and it goes into to detail in your book about the amount of influence that China has over this Southeast Asian realm. And so, we've talked about the cultures melding, the Chinese populating other places to go away from China. And then economically, it's very complex, but China is working hard to be everyone's biggest trading partner. All right. So final thing, we move back to oil and gas, and we've touched on this in every week in every lecture too, is where are the oil and gas reserves? Who who owns the land? Who owns the pipeline? Where do the tankers cross through? And Indonesia is one of the world's top 15 powers in oil and gas industry, so it has quite a lot. Now we talk about moving into the future and climate change, and all of the ones that we have looked at, all of the realms that we've looked at have had parts of them that were their economies and everything were very dependent on petroleum products. So when we look at tackling global warming, again, we're going to be looking at people's livelihoods. We're going to be looking at jobs. We're going to be looking at, economies. And these are things that are going to have to be hashed out within countries and without. But climate change is going to affect Indonesia and this area just like everyone else. If there's increased flooding on the deltas, then you could lose agricultural land on the mainland. With increasing sea level, you could have flooding of some of the islands. There's the warming waters, temperatures and acidity will affect fisheries in this area. So it's just another stop on the climate train to decide where countries that are going to have to make decisions about how they want to advance and how the international realm deals with these things. So that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions during the week, just give me a call or send me an email and I'll get right back to you. All right. You guys have a great week.